My name's Todd Miranda, and in this video I'm going to demonstrate how to animate a grid length property of a grid in WPF. So let's begin with Visual Studio 2008. We'll choose File, New, Project. We're going to choose a WPF application project and we'll name it accordingly. Alright, so let's just take and we're going to increase the size of our default window to 400 by 400. Just gives us a little bit more space. And we're going to go with our default grid layout panel that's given to us. And we're going to add some row definitions. We'll just have two rows. We'll have row definition with a height of, say, 50. And then we'll have a row definition with height of, say, 100. And we're going to give this row definition a name. Row 2. Alright, so let's create some column definitions. Actually, you know what? We'll just stick with one column. That'll make it simpler. Alright, so there's our two rows. Let's go ahead and in the first row we're just going to put a button. So we'll do button grid.row equals 0. Click equals, and we'll let it create our event handler for us. Content will just simply be the word trigger. So this is what we'll use to trigger our animation. Alright, in the next row we need to have enough content to have it fill up some space so we can actually see what's going on. So we'll do stack panel grid.row equals 1. We'll set a background so it'll be easier to see. Maybe we'll just go with blue. And then inside of our stack panel we'll just have some text blocks. So let's just have a text block. Text equals, we'll say this. We'll do like this. We'll say this is some text in row. Fair enough. So that's pretty much all we need to be able to have our grid and be able to demonstrate how we're going to do our animation. So let's go ahead and build our window.resources block. And we'd like to do our animation in here. And what we want to animate is we want to animate this row definition right here because we want to expand it and collapse it. Here's the problem. The width and height of a column or a row in a grid uses a property of type grid length. Well, there is no animation for grid length. Grid length doesn't have an animation that goes with it. We have a double animation, we have this kind of thing, but we don't have an animation object to animate an actual grid length property. So we're going to build that. We're going to build a custom animation to be able to animate our grid length property of our, in this case, our row. So let's just start from the top. I'm going to right click on, or I'm going to go to my project. I'm going to add a class. So we're going to build a class to be able to do our grid length animation. So it makes sense that we would call this grid length animation. Okay, so now the class needs to inherit from animation timeline, because that's effectively what we're doing, is we're building this animation timeline. And if you haven't included the assembly or the namespace for animation timeline, you can right click on this, do resolve, and then using system.media.animation. It's a shortcut to be able to figure out what kind of using statements you're going to need. Okay, so we're going to need a couple of properties. We're going to need a from and a to property. So, and they need to be dependency properties. Remember, because we can only animate dependency properties. So we're going to do a public static read-only dependency property, and this is going to be our from property. Notice how we name that. The property is actually from, but for convention, we're going to name it from property because that is the property. We're also going to need a to, and thusly we name that to property. Again, if we don't have dependency property, the right using statement, we can include that by right-clicking on it and going to resolve. So now we need to instantiate our class, and it has to be a static grid length animation. And we need in the instantiation here, we need to register our dependency properties. Okay, so we're going to do from property equals dependency property dot register. Okay, so what is the name of our property? It's from. So then we do, what type of property is it? Well, it's of type grid length. And then who is the owner of this property? Well, type of grid length animation, because that is the class that this property exists in. And likewise, we need to register our to property. Its name is to, and it's also of type grid length, and it's also in the grid length animation. Now the animation timeline needs to be able to get a freezable type of object. So we're going to override protected override system.windows.freezable create instance core. And we're going to, when we create that, all we're going to do is do a return new grid length animation. So that handles that. Now we need to look at our property accessors. Actually, I guess before that we need to override. We're going to do a public override of the type called target type property, which the animation needs to know what type the target is going to be. So in our get, we know what type our properties are. Return type of grid length. Now let's take a look at our accessor for our from property. Grid length from, and we have our get, and here we're going to do a return. We're going to cast to grid length. Let me scroll this up a little bit. And we know that with dependency properties we use get and set values. So we're going to do get value grid length animation dot from property. And then we have our set, and we're going to do set value grid length animation dot from property to value. Okay, and if you didn't imagine, our to property will look very similar to this, except this is going to be dot to property, and likewise this will be to property. Now this might be the only part that you might consider a little bit difficult, and it's really not. We're going to have to override the current value, the get current value. So we're going to override public override object get current value. Right, now get current value takes the default origin value, the default destination value, and an animation clock. And now what we're going to do is we're simply going to say we're going to create a local variable double the current from value equals, and we're going to grid length, do a get value. We're going to get the grid length animation dot from property and return its value, and we're going to do the same thing for to value. Dot to property. Okay, so we have the from and the to value. Now we can actually get the current value of the progress of the animation. Alright, so if the animation goes from 0 to 100, we're going to scale that on a scale of 0 to 1. So when we look at the current progress of the animation, we're going to get a value from 0 to 1. So we can use that value as a multiplier to multiply against the difference between the from and to value to figure out exactly where the current grid length value should be given its animation progress. Alright, that'll make a little more sense when we take a look here. First thing we need to do is if from value is greater than to value. Alright, so if we're effectively if we're going in a positive direction, if we're going in a positive direction, then we need to return a value for its the current grid length value, and that's going to be this. We're going to do a new grid length. Alright, and that simply just takes a value for our grid length. So let's do 1 minus animation clock dot current progress dot value. So this gives us animation clock dot current progress dot value gives us the 0 to 1 value, which is the current progress of the animation clock. And if you think about it, this animation is happening over time, so we have this clock behind the scenes that's counting from the begin time to end time, and we want to look at that from a scale of 0 to 1 as far as where it is in its current progress, where it is in the progress. Now we want to take that, alright, we want to multiply that by the difference. Remember, if from is greater than 2, then we say from value minus to value. This is so that we stay in as a positive value. And then we're going to add back in the to value. This gives us, this is a typical, if you've ever seen a typical percentage type calculation, that's effectively what we're doing there. Now we have to type in the unit. And remember that in a grid we can do like a star, or we can actually have a hard-coded unit. We have to take that into account and send that unit type back. So we're going to do this by saying if this dot to, okay, so the to property, if that is star, and this is a nice property, the is star just simply tells us yes or no, this is a star type value. If it's is star, then return grid unit type dot star. Otherwise, return grid unit type dot pixel. And we're just not going to take into account auto. We'll do star or pixel in this particular case. So there we have it. Now we need to take care of the else scenario, and it shouldn't be surprising that it's going to look very, very similar to the other scenario. So if 2 is greater than, the to value is greater than the from value, then the first thing that happens is we don't need to do a 1 minus that value. We're going to take the actual value, we're going to swap these, so it's going to be to value minus from value, and obviously plus from value. Alright, again, to make it positive, we still do the same thing with the units, so no big problems there. And that is how we get the current value of the grid length based on the current progress of the animation clock. And that's all we have to do that custom animation. It may seem like a lot at first, but when you look at it, it's really not that much at all. And then to get rid of our unused usings, I'm going to right click, do organize usings, do remove unused usings. So we're down to just the using statements that we are using. Now let's go back over to our window1.xaml, and we need to add a new namespace. We'll do XML namespace grid anim, so for grid animation equals, and we're going to use the yes, this is what we want, just our local namespace. Now we can come into window.resources, we can do storyboard, give it an X key of grid in, and then we'll also have a grid out. This is going to be a grid anim grid length animation. Begin time equals 0, 0, 0. Duration we'll say 2 seconds. And we've got our storyboard dot target name is our row that we called row 2. Our storyboard dot target property is height. Now we can set the target property to height because we have our grid length animation. We'll go from 100 to 0, and then we'll copy this storyboard, create a storyboard out, and to make it easy, we'll just reverse the from and the to. Okay. So we've got our grid in and grid out. Now let's write our code behind to handle that based on when the button gets clicked and our trigger gets hit. The first thing that we want to do is we want to know the state of the current state of the grid, whether it's expanded or not. So we'll just create an isExpanded flag, and it's currently going to be expanded, all right, because that's just the way we built it. So in here we're going to do storyboard, we'll call that SB. Again, right click, resolve, add our using statement that we need. If underscore is expanded, else. So if it is currently expanded, we want to find the storyboard called grid in. So this dot find resource grid in as storyboard. Otherwise, we want our storyboard to be grid out. Grid out. Alright, so once we found our storyboard, we'll just do sb.begin, and we need to pass a name context for that. And since these elements that are being animated exist within the same scope as this namespace, we'll just do this. And then we need to toggle the isExpanded. isExpanded equals not is expanded. Okay, let's build that. And build started. Oh, I missed something in my... I guess it would help if I made my global variable global instead of in the actual instantiator. Alright, so let's build. And build started, build succeeded. Let's run this. Pop up our application. If we hit the button, we get our grid length animation going in, going out. So Not very complicated to build your own custom animation, and in this case, now that we've built this grid length animation, we could use it to animate grid width and height properties to be able to do some nice little expander type concepts with grids.